So welcome everybody to the Ocean and Coastal Resource Management Speaker Series. We are very excited to have another alum from our program, Clesi Bennett, who's going to talk about integrating environmental justice into coastal management. And she has some direct experience from her jobs right out of graduation, working in this space. And I think we'll have some interesting kind of lessons and observations to share with us. And I know many of our students are really interested in this topic, so this should be a real popular one, Clesi. So thanks so much for coming, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Jason. As Jason said, today I'm going to talk about integrating environmental justice into coastal zone management, and specifically I'm going to be talking about that experience in the San Francisco Bay Area. We passed policy a year ago, and so I'm going to be talking a bit about that process and some of the challenges and lessons that came from that opportunity. But first, I wanted to start with a little bit of information about who I am. When I was sitting in your shoes, going to the speaker series, there was an alum who presented, and she had a slide very similar to this, and it listed basically how she got from this to where she was then, which was, it gave me a great perspective and, let me look at another alum from the program and how her career trajectory turned out. So I figured I would do the same thing. So while I was at MISS, I had an internship with the Nature Conservancy working on the California Coastal Project. I did my CBE fellowship at the Coastal Conservancy, continued to work with the CBE as a research assistant on sea level rise vulnerability studies, then took my first job out of MISS at the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, or BCDC is how I'll refer to it. And now, I'm not sure if you can see it because of the videos, but I am at the California Natural Resources Agency working as an environmental scientist in the climate change program there. But today I'm going to be focusing on the work that I did while I was a coastal planner at BCDC. BCDC undertook an amendment to its policy framework to include environmental justice and social equity into that process. So I'm going to speak a bit about that, but first I wanted to get into a little bit of background. I don't know how much you all know about the topics of coastal zone management and environmental justice, so I figured I would do some basics first. So what is coastal zone management? The Coastal Zone Management Act is a federal law, it's an act of Congress that encourages the coastal states, and that includes the Pacific Territories as well as the Great Lakes states, to develop and implement these coastal zone management plans through coastal zone management agencies in each of the states. And these plans are really intended to protect and preserve our coastal resources, but also to develop and use these resources in a way that is sustainable. So you can see in the map, all the blue states are, the light blue states are the states that actually have certified programs and plans in place. So California is a little unique. Unlike most other states, we have 3 coastal zone management agencies. The 2 on the top, BCDC and the California Coastal Commission, are the regulatory arm of the program. So they're the ones that are approving or denying proposed development on the bay shoreline or the coast. And BCDC works specifically in the San Francisco Bay estuary, whereas the California Coastal Commission really works on the outer coast of California from Oregon down to Mexico. And then we have a really unique agency, the Coastal Conservancy. They're a non-regulatory arm of the program, but they are a big funder of coastal resource protection projects, restoration projects, coastal access projects. They're also able to acquire land, unlike the other 2 agencies. So they really play a big role in promoting resilience and access to the coast. So shifting gears to environmental justice. Environmental justice came about after many decades of disproportionate impacts on low income and communities of color from various development patterns. And this was often the siting of toxic waste facilities, industrial development, ports, wastewater treatment facilities, things like that. So the environmental justice movement is really fighting for the fair treatment of environmental laws, environmental development, and protections. So you can see the definition here on the slide. I'm not going to read it, but this is the definition that is included in the state law of California, and also it's the same definition that the US EPA uses as well. So how do these two areas intersect? There's a lot of injustices and inequities in our coastal zone, and not just in the California coastal zone. This is all coastal zones generally, but I'm specifically going to focus just on California here. One issue that has historically been an issue and is still an issue today is coastal in public access. And this started out many decades ago with actually physically excluding certain people from beaches in the state. And now this looks like, not having signage that's translated into the appropriate languages for the communities that live there. It might be a freeway that's bisecting a community and not allowing certain community members to get to the coast. It might be lack of public transportation to actually get to the coast, things like that. Another big issue, and this is an issue that's going to continue to be bigger and bigger, is vulnerability to sea level rise and flooding. Certain communities along the coast have a lower ability to prepare for, respond to, and recover from a major flooding event. And this typically tends to be communities who have less resources, who have been historically underrepresented in policymaking, communities of color, immigrant communities, elderly communities, and so forth. Another big issue, and this falls really squarely into what environmental justice was historically intended to fight, was polluting industry. The coast, especially the Bay Area, has been home to many polluting industries, and that's because a lot of these facilities need water to operate. So you see wastewater treatment plants, you see ports, you see other marine industries like oil and gas right on the coastline. And these are often located right next to or in low-income and communities of color around our coastline. Another issue is we've got a ton of great projects on the coast right now to restore wetlands, to improve access to our coastal resources, but a lot of these projects are not driven or led by community groups themselves. So we'd really like to see a push and a transfer of power to these communities. And lastly, and this is by no means just specific to coastal management, this is a problem in government writ large, is the lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion in staff who regulate this area. Unfortunately, our staffs do not reflect the population of the state of California like they should. So how did this come about at BCDC? So at BCDC, this is really a bottom-up effort. Planning staff who were conducting research about how BCDC's regulatory framework should shift as sea levels rose, identified a number of issues where BCDC's policies currently fell short in addressing new challenges. And one of these issues was equity implications and environmental justice implications with rising seas. And this actually opened the door to a lot of other issues related to environmental justice that the commission could better address. So this led to a formal Bay Plan amendment. So the San Francisco Bay Plan is BCDC's regulatory framework. It houses all their policies. It's how they implement their law. When someone goes to the commission with a proposal to build something on the Bay or in the Bay, permit analysts at BCDC are going to be looking for consistency with the Bay Plan in order to recommend approval of that project. And when you're not consistent, your project could be denied theoretically. So this process kicked off in July of 2017 with a formal initiation and ended in October 2019 with the formal adoption of the policies. So the next slide, I'm going to get a little bit more into what that process looked like. So as I said, it was initiated in July 2017. And that was followed by an initial scoping and organizing, staffing, getting everything set up to take on this amendment. Then the first several months consisted of background research, which included targeted interviews and attending various community group meetings and whatnot. This was followed by a series of workshops, first focused on problem identification, and then later focused on how to address these problems that were identified in the earlier workshops. After that, the policy changes were drafted. And then the way BCDC's process works is you release a preliminary recommendation, people comment, you have a public hearing, more people comment, the commissioners comment, staff goes back and revises that recommendation, and they propose a revised recommendation. And then, depending on what the commission thinks, they can send it back to another hearing if they want, or they can choose to have a vote. So this slide actually came from my presentation at the vote. That's why there's a little red box around the word vote. So we only had one public hearing in the vote, thankfully, and that was really because we kind of pushed the public hearing out to where we knew that most folks were in agreement with what we were proposing. And then after the vote, in California, if you want to make a rulemaking change like this was, you have to go through the Office of Administrative Law to prove to them that you followed the right process that is stipulated in the law, and that includes things like noticing and public comment and whatnot. So we had to do that for the state of California, but also for NOAA, so that we could include these policy changes in the Certified Coastal Management Program for California. So this process for this amendment was really unique for BCDC. Most policy amendments that BCDC had taken on prior to this were smaller. They were extensions of policies or revisions of policies that had already been written, and perhaps new science or new data had come out. This was really a new ballgame. So we had three really unique components to this process that weren't really seen in BCDC's other policymaking processes. First was a commissioner working group, and this was a subset of about 6 commissioners from the larger BCDC commission who met monthly to really champion the amendment to the rest of the commission. Again, this was like new territory for BCDC, and we weren't sure if the commission was even going to vote for it at the end of the day. So these folks really became our champions and really helped us in crafting the policy language. And a lot of BCDC's commissioners are actually local elected officials, so it was pretty interesting to get to work with them, and they were trying to channel their constituents' voices as well. Another unique part of this process was the creation of an environmental justice review team. This was a group of community leaders and environmental justice leaders from around the Bay Area who were actually funded by the Resources Legacy Fund to participate in the weeds in our project. So getting into the policy drafting itself. This picture right here is a picture of those two groups meeting together and having a joint meeting and discussing these different policy changes. The last unique part of this policy amendment process was just the importance and the emphasis on engagement with the public through workshops and community meetings, not just the standard public comment. We really wanted to go beyond that. So next, I want to touch on some of the major policy areas that were addressed in the amendment itself, so you have an idea of what some of the policy changes actually looked like. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's a lot. We added a new section to the Bay Plan, and we amended 3 current sections that were already there. So that was public access, shoreline protection, and mitigation. So this issue of meaningful community involvement was a topic that we decided was important enough to add into every single one of those chapters. So now when folks come to the commission wanting to get approval for a project, they are now required to conduct meaningful community involvement. And we have the definition that we use for this was the EPA's definition. We don't have a prescriptive formula, not like you must have 5 meetings with 100 people each. Nothing like that, because it's really hard to make a prescriptive policy like that because every project is so different. But what we do require is that there is meaningful community involvement that can be demonstrated to the commission, and written evidence of what the project proponent did with this feedback and what changes were made or not made with that feedback. We also require that the engagement be culturally appropriate, including being translated into the appropriate languages for the community. Another issue area that was really big for us was public access. So BCDC requires public access with any project that is approved on the Bay shoreline. So it's involved in every single project that BCDC works on. So this is a really big and important issue to staff. So the amendment really emphasizes the need for public access that is inclusive, that is barrier-free, and we detail this to mean barrier-free for people with disabilities, barrier-free for people with economic constraints, barrier-free for basically like the signage needs to be in the right language, the programming that happens at the site needs to be culturally relevant to the communities. We really wanted the public access to reflect the communities that it was serving. So the policies are written in such a way that the design of the public access should really be driven by the communities themselves. So another big issue area that we tackled was shoreline protection. This is a really big issue in the Bay Area with rising sea levels, and it will continue to be important going forward. So for shoreline protection, there was really two pieces to this policy change. First was with the creation of hard shoreline armoring, there's wave reflection. So you have a seawall, wave comes in and it reflects, and it causes erosion and flooding at adjacent communities. So if your adjacent community is a lower income community who can't afford to build protection at the same level, that community is going to flood because of your seawall. So the policy requires project proponents to build softer solutions to reduce that wave reflection if possible, and if not, to mitigate for any kind of adjacent impacts. The other issue that we took up in this amendment was contamination. So like I said in the beginning, there's a lot of industrial development around the Bay shoreline, and because of this, there is a lot of contamination in the soils right on shore, but also in the subtidal areas. So a lot of these contaminated sites are just capped, and they're not necessarily thinking about climate change and sea level rise and changes to groundwater levels in the design of these contamination remediation projects. So this policy change requires any kind of remediation that's occurring on the Bay shoreline to incorporate the science around sea level rise, storm surge, and associated groundwater changes. So the last issue that I want to touch on is the issue of fair treatment. And if you remember, this is kind of the meat of what environmental justice is. So this policy change really gets at trying to minimize, avoid, or mitigate for any kind of disproportionate impacts that a project may have. So first, this policy requires that project proponents identify if there are any disproportionate impacts, and they have to do this identification in conjunction with the community members. And then they need to either minimize, avoid, or compensate for any kind of impacts. So although we had a fairly successful amendment, it was passed, every commissioner voted for it, we had a great record, no one voted against it, no one abstained, so that was wonderful. We did have challenges along the way, as you do with any kind of program and any kind of change. These challenges are really listed in chronological order for the project process. So one of the big issues that came up, and this was actually prior to my time at BCDC, this was when staff was trying to get the amendment initiated, was general staff buy-in. The amendment really initiated in the planning staff, who were kind of the researchers on staff. They also happen to be like the young people on staff. And there were other folks on staff who just didn't see the connection between coastal management and environmental justice and equity. I'm a scientist or I'm an engineer and I don't understand how this relates to my work, or I don't have the right tools to do that. So that was an initial hurdle in getting the amendment initiated. After that, we really hit the wall with a lack of trust in established community relationships. Most governments face this when they're trying to do any kind of community engagement, and this is, due to decades and decades of being excluded or having your input just squashed and not taken into account over and over again. So this was a hurdle that we faced consistently throughout the process. We did make some breakthroughs in working with folks and really starting to build trust, but this is a long-term game. We may have started some things, but there's a lot more to go there. Another issue is lack of resources. BCDC had enough funding to pay for my staff time to work on this amendment, and that was it. There was no money for community engagement, no money for events, for workshops. We did like everything. Was just staff, pulling it together. And like, luckily we had a lot of folks on staff who were really by the time we were, in full swing with the public workshops, a lot of staff members were really bought in and really excited and, volunteered their free time to help. We went to lots of meetings at night, that kind of thing. But yeah, no resources to actually carry it out beyond staff time, which is unfortunate. Another issue that came up once we started to dig into the weeds and actually mess with the policy language was the limited authority and jurisdiction of BCDC. BCDC works in the space of coastal zone management. Environmental justice is much larger than that. Social equity is even larger than that. So there were a lot of issues that community members were bringing to us that we just couldn't deal with because they were not at all in BCC's purview, and they were actually under the purview of another agency or the local government. And this was things like air pollution. This was things like siting of development outside the coastal zone, housing issues, gentrification, issues that just BCC couldn't do anything about unless they were to get their law amended by the legislature, which would be highly unlikely that it would go all the way through without getting squashed. Another issue is BCC's jurisdiction. It's the bay, the waters of the bay itself, and 100 feet around that. That doesn't include a lot of space. A lot of people live outside of those 100 feet. So that was another issue that we were constantly battling. So I put pushback on here, and this, I mean pushback once we shared the policy. So once we actually released drafts, we had some initial pushback from the development community, worried that these policies and any kind of regulatory changes generally would add to the timelines of their projects, would drive their costs up and things like that. And then lastly, there was just a lack of precedent on this issue area in coastal zone management policymaking. We couldn't look to other states to see what they had done. Luckily, our sister agencies were also in a similar space, so we were able to coordinate with them, but there wasn't a lot of research out there or policy examples out there to look at. So although there were all these challenges, there were also lots of opportunities. We did a ton of staff training on environmental justice, on racial equity, on social equity, and that made a huge difference. We started a monthly meeting for staff just to come and talk about various things that they had read or various issues that we had brought up, and it kind of morphed into like a book club on various racial justice topics, which was great. And then I have this little thing here that says GARE. GARE stands for the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, which was a program that BCDC was lucky enough to send staff to participate in. And it's a year-long training series where folks get to learn about the history of the government in racism and racial inequities and what government can do to fix those things. So that really, it was a really amazing transition to see a staff who was didn't really understand how this related to their work from thinking about it all the time. And, I heard from a former coworker recently that like people ask about it for every project. They want to know, like, it's been an amazing transition to see that culture shift. Another opportunity that BCDC seized was the NOAA 309 grants. So these are grants that NOAA gives to the coastal zone management programs to update and enhance their management programs and their plans. So BCDC used this to fund my staff time. And this was a topic BCDC, and I'm racking my brain now because I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think any other coastal zone management agency had used that to fund environmental justice work. It's typically standard coastal management, coastal resource protection type stuff. The other opportunity that we had was that EJ review team that I referred to, that group of community leaders who were involved in our process, were funded through the Resources Legacy Fund. And by pass through, I mean that Resources Legacy Fund passed that money straight to the community groups, and it never touched the government, because as soon as it touches the government, it goes through a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of strings become attached, and there's a lot more rules about what can be spent on what. So we were lucky enough to kind of coordinate this funding without it coming through us, and this was a great workaround to pay for people's time to really be invested in our process. Another big opportunity that BCDC seized when the budget cycle came up for last year was hiring a full-time and permanent environmental justice and community engagement staff member. This is so important for continuing those community relationships and building that trust that I mentioned. So I was on the planning staff. This was one of my projects. I had other projects. It was my main project, but I had other projects that were going to surpass this after the vote. And I had done that transition, but luckily we had just hired this person to take on this work full time. And now it was just amazing to have a dedicated resource to that, because that had been a huge hurdle in getting this work going at the pace and at the scale that it really needed to be at. And lastly, as I mentioned, our sister agencies, so the Coastal Commission, Coastal Conservancy, also the State Lands Commission, not technically in the Coastal Zone Management Program, but has some jurisdiction authority around coastal resources in the state. We're all developing environmental justice programs and policies at the same time. So we were able to learn from each other. We were able to co-host workshops and discuss various policy issues and permitting challenges and whatnot. And that was really invaluable to the process, to have another agency who is doing a similar but slightly different thing. However, there's still lots of room for improvement. So yes, BCDC passed this great policy, and it was, there was a lot of support for it, and they're implementing it now, which is great, but it's still not a perfect system. Like I said in the beginning, there's still very few community-led or driven initiatives. Like, yes, we want the community to be meaningfully engaged in process, but what if the community just led the process? That would be even better. What if they were the ones who were, taking on these projects on the shoreline? That would be amazing. Like I said before, this dedicated time, staff time is super important. BCC has one person now. That's great. You could probably use some more. I know Coastal Commission now has 2. Also great. Coastal Conservancy doesn't have a full-time position yet, but I know it's something that they're really working on, because it is really essential in getting that work going forward. The next 2, I mentioned these at the beginning, but there are a lot of barriers to getting into this work. So there's a lot of barriers in getting hired at the state, and in particular getting into the coastal zone management agencies and getting into the right classifications. And then also there's barriers to getting appointments at these agencies, commissions, and boards. So the commissions and the boards are really the decision makers for these organizations. So having those reflect the state of California would be really ideal. And then lastly, I don't know how, well, maybe this is more likely in the next 4 years than it was in the past 4 years, but NOAA could also amend its laws and its policies and programs to better incentivize coastal management programs to really take on environmental injustice and social inequity in the coastal zone. So that's another change that I think could help other states get on board. So with that, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. When I was applying to state jobs, it was a very complicated and confusing process, and I did not understand really how it worked. And then someone explained it to me, and it made a world of difference. Now I'm on my second state job, third state agency. So I'm going to quickly just give you guys a little primer of what it's like to get a job in the state of California. So this link, calcareers.ca.gov, is the main, like, you should write this down. This is where all the jobs are posted. This is where the processes are posted, everything on that website. So the process of getting a state job, you may have heard this, that you need to be on the classification list before you can apply to the state job. So that's the main takeaway there. And there's kind of two ways to do this. You can either look at all the different classifications, take the tests, and then see what jobs they post under those tests. Or you can look at the job you want, see what classification is, and then get on the list. Either way, you have to get on the list before you apply to the job. If you apply to the job before you get on the list, you'll be disqualified. So you don't want to do that. So there are several, there's several classification series that I would recommend for you all. The two on the top, and I don't know if you can see the one on the right, but they're the Coastal Program Analyst Series and the Conservation Project Development Analyst. These are the two main series for the coastal zone management agencies in California. They're the two most narrow on this page, but those will feed right into BCDC, Coastal Commission, and Coastal Conservancy. The next two are a little bit broader. They're also hired by the Natural Resources Agency, Ocean Protection Council, Cal EPA, Caltrans, other environmental agencies. And these are the Research Data Analyst Series and the Environmental Scientist Series. And then the last one on this page is a very broad classification that is used by many state agencies. And it's the Associate Governmental Program Analyst. And this classification is used for research and policy development, but it's also used for budgeting, personnel, project management, business services, and lots more stuff. So these are some of the classification series I'd have you, I'd recommend that you look at. And these are series, so they have journeys. You start out as Coastal Program Analyst 1, and then you go to 2, and so you want to look at them a little bit and see where you might fit on that spectrum, because you may not necessarily come in at 1. You may be able to go in at 2, or a specialist, or 3, or whatnot. So civil service exams. To get on the classification list, you have to take an exam. And I put exam in quotation marks because some of them feel like actual exams and some of them do not. Some of them are experience-based, so that means you're just literally putting in your experience. So like, how many months do you have experience in doing, data collection? How many months do you have experience in doing report writing, stuff like that? Not really an exam, just you putting your resume into a different format. And then there's knowledge-based exams where they actually ask you questions about their programs or about policy issues or about topics in the field. Some of the exams are online, some of them are in person, some of them are written, some of them are oral. So those are also good things to know. And the last bit about retests, just make sure you read everything about the exam. Some of them, if you don't pass it and you want to take it again, you may have to wait a year or a year and a half. So you want to know what that period is and make sure before you take the test that you're going to pass it, or you're fairly confident you're going to pass it. So the best thing that can really help you prepare for this is the exam bulletin. And the exam bulletin, you would just go onto Google and say like environmental scientist, California bulletin, and you'll get to the page you want to be at. And the bulletin has a number of things that are really important for you to look at. One is the minimum qualifications. So are you actually eligible to take the exam? Two would be the position description. So that is shows you what kind of jobs hire from that classification. The examination scope. So that will tell you if it's an experience-based exam, a knowledge-based exam, what they're going to test on. The examination preview will actually give you a series of questions that are very similar to the actual question. So this is a really good chance to practice what you're going to say or write out. And then lastly, this, and most importantly, this is where the actual link is to the real exam. I was going to walk through a demo, but since I had some screen sharing issues, I'm actually not going to do that. So lastly, I just wanted to give a plug for all the different fellowships out there. I didn't necessarily do any of these, but I have friends from MISS who did some of them. I've worked with some of them since leaving MISS. They're another great opportunity if you're not ready to just like dive in and take a permanent position with the state of California. Sea Grant and the Executive Fellowship Program place fellows in state agencies working on various topics. CivicSpert and Climate Corps place a lot of fellows in local and regional governments working on climate or other environmental like water issues or food issues. And then the Capital Fellows Program places fellows with the legislature. And so you could get placed with, the Natural Resources Committee or the Water Committee or something. So that's all I have for you all. And so I guess that leaves us 20 minutes to chat. And Jason, I don't know how you want to do that.
Yeah, Rachel has been kind of emceeing the questions. So Rachel, do you want to take over?
I've done a bad job of emceeing tonight. I do not have any questions from the students yet, but I have allowed everyone to unmute themselves. So I don't know if we want to let people just jump in. If you have a question, or Jason, if you have a question, give people a chance to.
I have a question.
Oh, very good. Please jump in.
So I was just wondering, from your experience, how well you felt prepared from your graduate school to take those exams, or whether you, it's not really phrased well, whether you felt like the school had done enough to prepare you for the exams, or if your internship and practicum experience was what really made you feel prepared.
Yeah, so I think for the experience-based exams where they, you're just inputting how long you've done something, I would say it was a mix of both. So I was looking at what I had done in my classes and how, what projects I had taken on, and I supplemented that by all of the other work I had done. The other questions are things you can typically prepare for. So they're going to ask you typical, for instance, the CPA exam, they ask you about the Coastal Act specifically. So, you can read the Coastal Act and memorize sections of it and stuff like that. So that was a very easy way to prepare. And that made me, feel very confident in answering the questions. But the substance-based questions about the field in general, I do feel like the classes that I took at MISS did prepare me well for those. I will say the only knowledge-based exam I have taken was the CPA exam, and I've taken that at 1, 2, and 3. The other ones that I've taken have all been the experience-based, so I haven't had that much experience, but I will say doing the OCRM track at MISS I did feel prepared to answer the questions in the CPA series.
Nice. Other questions for Clesi? And if you're there, turn on your camera so we can see you all. I'll go with a question while maybe other people are kind of just letting it percolate a little. What do you think is the next step for environmental justice? If you were trying to push, a new evolution in the approach? You know, I know you haven't been in this for 20 years or whatever, but you know, from what you've seen, like what would be really a nice value add for a new approach to this issue?
I think, let's see, this is not, so I kind of separate these issues in my brain. When I think about environmental justice, I think about reducing or eliminating disproportionate impacts on low income and communities of color, and specifically, you know, environmental harms. And then I think of tribal land management as separate. Some agencies have those together, environmental justice and tribal affairs. But I think tribes do face many environmental injustices, but they also have very unique challenges given their land sovereignty and history. I think one of the biggest areas where there's a lot of potential, I mean, we just haven't done a lot, is increasing the amount of tribal management and ownership of lands in California and allowing for traditional ecological practices. We're seeing this is like high on my mind because of the fire season that we just had. In the northern part of the state, there are tribes who do cultural burnings, which actually prescribed burnings are very good for the landscape, are reducing these really large scale fires. So I think that there's a lot of potential for transferring of land. And I think that is a big cultural shift. And, you know, giving up power, giving up land ownership, that's huge. And the Resources Agency has done 2 smaller projects this past year. I think one, I'm going to forget where they are now, but basically State Lands Commission led one, and the Resources Agency proper led the other, where they actually either provided the funds for the agency to purchase, or that tribe to purchase the land, or they transfer the land over. Along that similar vein, I really think that like the next step is just a transfer of power, is having community leaders as decision makers. You know, they need to be on these boards and commissions. They need to be the heads of these boards and commissions. They need to be staffed at agencies. I think that is really an area that, you know, we can make policies, we can involve people, but giving up power is like another step.
Yeah, it's really fascinating you say that. I'm one of the people we work with a little is Deb Haaland, who's the Congresswoman from New Mexico, and we're really rooting for her to be the first Native American, you know, head of the Department of Interior.
Yeah.
That's kind of exactly along the lines you said. Like, there's only so much inclusion. You just have to give the reins to them. So that's really interesting that you focus in on that. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Other people, questions for Clesi? Everybody's burnt out at the end of the semester here. Rachel, you got any questions?
Well, it's, I don't know if you know anything about the Point Melades issue. This is something that one of our partners, David Helvarg of Blue Frontier, has been working on. And it's you know, they're in Point Richmond, very much the area where, like we said, okay, San Francisco is going to put all our oil and gas production, you know, right here, and a lot of toxic things going on right there. And of course, this is where we, you know, there's a lot of Black and brown people, and they have this beautiful park right now to access their coastline that is threatened by development, by someone wealthy trying to do. But after hearing your presentation, I'm like, how is this guy, how would anyone ever be able to take away that park from the people of Point Richmond? I don't understand how that's even possible.
I think I know the exact
Oh, good.
You're talking about. Yeah, and there's a lot of feelings just like that about it. Yeah, I mean, I think, so this kind of stuff happened a lot at, like, when I was at BCDC, and people were like, you need, like, stop this development, like, stop it from happening. This is bad for X, Y, and Z reasons. This really fell into the bucket of those challenges we faced about limited jurisdiction and authority. BCDC this is unlike the Coastal Commission, by the way, has very limited authority to deny, like to full on deny a project. They can condition, it up and down with all kinds of things, but it's very hard for them to fully deny it. So that's where I think there's opportunities for local government, for the regional governments like BCDC or like, whoever else is in the area to really work together on these type of issues. And we were constantly trying to pull the local governments along with us, because so much in California, so much land use authority resides in the local government, planning commissions, basically, given it's like California's like a home rule state, right? So that means that local governments basically get to dictate what they do with their land. So we were always really encouraging, when projects were going through their local approval before they came to BCDC, to start integrating community involvement then, because there's so much, local governments just have so much discretion. And, we're lucky that in 2017, it came into force, SB 1000, which was a law that required local governments to include environmental justice into their general plans. So some local governments have started to do this, and hopefully more will continue to do this. And then I think you'll see local governments having a much stronger, I don't know, like, I don't want to say like a club, but like basically a tool to do something about that kind of issue.
That's great.
I think Natasha here, do you want to ask your question about for non-US citizens?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted, because you were walking us through the process of getting a job at the state level, and I just wondered, are there opportunities for non-US citizens to get involved, or is that kind of very strictly you have to be?
That's a great
American?
question. I don't know the definite answer. I like, my gut is that you don't have to be, but I would want to double check that. But I can get back to you. I can check that for you, and I'll get back to you on it.
Yeah, and actually, real quick,
thank
you
you.
know Maria Lopez, Clesi? Because she's I'm pretty sure she's Argentinian, and she's been working with Aaliyah at the Department of Natural Resources. And so I know, I'm pretty sure we have a real recent alumni who is.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so definitely.
So
like graduate assist, like graduate, what do they call them? Graduate assistants and environmental services interns and like that, like those, like definitely. I don't think there's a restriction. I'm like pretty sure there's not, but I don't want to promise. And then there's something I haven't thought of, but I can like get back to you and be 100% clear. But yeah, I do know who you're referring to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I just had a quick question about the history of BCDC. Did it proceed from the Save the Bay movement back in the early or middle 60s?
Yes, that is correct. So Save the Bay, basically what was happening was the bay was being filled haphazardly, and filled by, I mean, like people were like literally dumping like trash into the bay, like large amounts of trash. And then they were also just building land to develop on. And this had a lot of issues. A, it was like destroying habitat, but B, it wasn't seismically safe. I mean, like lots of issues. So these three women from the East Bay created Save the San Francisco Bay, which just became Save the Bay. And they appealed to the legislature, and we got to the McAteer-Petrus Act, 1965, which halted this haphazard filling of the bay and created BCDC to regulate filling of the bay and balance conservation and development. So,
thank you for helping to save the bay.
Yep.
And they were three, like at the time in the 60s, housewives, not a lot of power themselves, but they used their voice, which is also something I'm seeing. This is the power of Black Lives Matter movement. This is the power that we have regardless. But yeah, that was definitely an example of not high status people
Oh yeah,
Movement.
not heard of. 3 women going to the legislature, pretty unique. But 3 incredibly dedicated women who spent a lifetime being great stewards and examples of stewardship for the Bay.
Pretty inspiring. In fact, there was a PBS documentary hour long on all 3 of those women about 10 years ago.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe we should check that out. That might be a good little screening party for IEP. Here, Alice, maybe you can make a note of that. We'll screen that documentary. Yeah, awesome.
Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate you mentioning
Yeah,
that.
that's a good rec.
Yeah, I
any
mean,
last- sorry, go on.
No, I was just gonna say it's a fascinating story, and BCDC. I didn't say this in the presentation, but when they created BCDC, it was a very unique and different kind of organization that didn't exist anywhere, and BCDC became the first coastal zone management agency in the world, which is pretty unique. Before the Coastal Zone Management Act, before Coastal Commission, anywhere else. So it was definitely innovative and ahead of its time.
Nice. Any last questions here for Clesi?
I have a question. I was wondering if you could maybe expand on what it would look like to remove the barriers to access to make commissions look more representative of the populations they serve.
For commissions, yeah. So this is a lot of culture shifts too. So BCDC's commission is very large. It's like about 26 or 28 people. Most of them are local elected officials. So this would be running, more Black and brown people from communities, supporting them, just like we've seen kind of precedent numbers around the country. So getting more folks into office who reflect the state population. But that's just one part of the commissioners. There's also some subject matter experts. So there's, someone who kind of represents water quality, someone who represents civil engineering. So this could be either just appointing a different person, and the agencies that they come from, so like Army Corps, US EPA, they could appoint different people, but their hiring practices need to change. And then if you keep going down a step down from that, is you see environmental studies and environmental science programs and STEM programs even around the country are very white. So encouraging more people of color into these programs, providing paid internships for them, showing how the environment and making sure that the work you do relates to the everyday experience of people, I think is a huge way to bridge that gap. The other sect of people who are on BCDC's commission, and this is how a lot of people get into government is through these appointments. So they're gubernatorial, so they're appointed by the governor, or they're appointed by the state assembly or the state senate. And that, a lot of times that's a politics game, it's who you know and what your connections are. And that, I think, kind of goes back to that giving up power and really uplifting other folks. Hope that answers.
Great. All right. Well, look, Clesi, you obviously have a wealth of knowledge that you've generated over these last few years. You sound like a seasoned professional already.
Thanks.
So thank you so much. If any students have follow-up questions, I'll forward them your email if you don't mind. And
yeah, I just put it in the chat if anyone
oh, you did. Perfect.
has anything that they want to ask about the work I did, or about any of those organizations that I put their pictures up, or about working here.
Outstanding. All right, everybody, let's call it a night, and everybody have a great rest of the evening, or if you're East Coast, have a nice night's sleep. Take care.
Great. Thank